Hi, brothers and sisters. Mark Ogletree here. Welcome to Education Week this year in 2020. I know 2020 has been a very interesting year, but I am grateful, as well as so many of you, that we have this modern technology to help deliver awesome and wonderful content from so many people this year at Education Week, and glad that I can be a part of it. Look forward to listening and hearing some of the messages myself with my family this year as we sit in our own homes to watch Education Week. The topic that I want to talk to you about today is grit, and that's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I think we tried to raise our children with grit. We have 8 children and we have 16 grandchildren now. I'm very interested in their lives and how they grow up and if they're able to develop grit, because I do think that they're going to need that if they're going to survive in this world here in the last days. I think of something Elder Anderson said, that the world is not going to glide calmly into the second coming. And we know that we've seen a lot of craziness just this year, and our ability to raise a generation that's resilient, a generation that has incredible coping skills, is what we're going to need if we're going to navigate that space. Now, one of the things I think of a lot is just how I grew up. And I recognize that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and the generations prior to that could tell tales that were much more significant in terms of their grit. I think of my own parents who milked cows at 5 in the morning before they went to school, and I never had to do anything like that. But I just think that in our day, everyone, it seemed like all your peers, people had broken bones. People always had stitches, right? People had scabs and all kinds of physical aches and pains, and that was not when they were old people. That was when they were pretty young. And you don't see that as much today. In fact, I'm the bishop of our ward right now, and I can't think of one kid in our ward that has stitches or a broken arm, although there may have been a few along the way. I think of the playground equipment that we had back in our day that was so dangerous, right? The merry-go-round, the whirly-bird, the 2-story high metal slides. Now we have a lot of playgrounds that are cushioned and with sanitizing gel at each station, right? You failed a class in those days, that stunk. That was just terrible. You failed a class, you got a paperback with red ink all over it. That was not unusual for me, by the way. I remember in 7th grade driving up to the school with my parents to see if I had made the 7th grade basketball team. And my name was not on the list, right? You got cut. You didn't make it. You drove home and you were pretty sad about stuff like that. Losing the Pinewood Derby and driving home thinking, wow, that was terrible, right? But you learn from those experiences. Not everyone got a trophy. In fact, we loved being outside so much in those days. Our mom, like so many of your moms of your generations, had a dinner bell, right, that they rang. And sometimes it took 3 times to get us to come home. Now, I think of some of my own students that I teach here at Brigham Young University that struggle with some of those skills, some of those challenges that they may have in terms of developing some grit and some resiliency. It's not too, it's quite common, I should say, to have students who are sending me emails saying, oh my gosh, I forgot to take the test. Oh shoot, I forgot to write that paper. Oh man, I did not know we had a final today. And then often it's followed by some excuse about didn't set the alarm, adjustments on medication right now, having trouble at home or whatever. And those are often some of the reasons why some of our students aren't able to perform at the level that they would like to. We also have students that don't agree with what we teach. And as we teach in the class that I teach, a class on the eternal family, of course, the teachings of the prophets, the scripture, and the family proclamation are the documents we base our class on, and the teachings of those prophets, right? Not unusual, at least once or twice a semester, to have a student approach us and say, hey, I would like you to get rid of all those readings. I don't agree with that. I think that's offensive to me. And we haven't ever had those type of things happen ever before. In fact, I would have never dreamed as a college student at BYU to come and approach my professor and demand that they change the reading requirements in a class because I didn't agree with it, right? But in our day, that's becoming more common. In fact, this one student that demanded that I change the readings for our course, all the readings were talks by apostles and prophets, right? So now on many college campuses throughout our country, it's not surprising that if students are upset by a professor and the things that are taught or by a guest speaker who comes to visit the campus, they have a designated room now where they can go and console each other, right? We call it the iPhone generation or Generation Z, a generation that definitely has a passion for safety. And that safety includes when people disagree with us or when we disagree with them. At San Diego State University, in a recent survey, 75% of the students interviewed agreed that if many students disagree with the views of someone who has been invited to speak on the campus, the student should create a safe space for other students to come during that speech. Newsweek reported 1 year ago, it was like August the 19th last year, that at the University of California at Berkeley, that there would be free counseling services provided if the students felt threatened by a guest speaker who was coming to talk about perhaps some political ideas that those students weren't fond of. And so I'd like to, for you to consider this. Talk show radio host Charles Sykes once wrote that instead of preparing children to deal with the inevitable scratches, the bumps, and the bruises of growing up, modern parents insist now that we should swaddle our children in bubble wrap. The modern bubble wrap mentality assumes that children are so frail and easily bruised that they have to be insulated from life. No losing, no disappointments, no harsh reality checks. But like a child who grows up in a bubble without developing any immunities to the outside world, a child raised in bubble wrap is not prepared for the symptoms of life. I think it's a great statement. It also kind of puts it on us as parents that there's probably a lot of things that we can do, a lot of things that we could probably do better. Gene Twenge, the author of iGen, and by the way, an incredible book on Generation Z, or what we call often now the iPhone generation. Overall, children are more carefully protected than they once were. As Hannah Rosen observed in The Atlantic, actions that would have been considered paranoid in the 70s, walking third graders to school, forbidding your kid to play ball in the street, going down the slide with a child in your lap, are now routine. In fact, they are markers today of good, responsible parenting. But these are not just perceptions. In 1969, 48% of elementary school and middle school students walked or rode a bike to school. By 2009, only 13% did. Even among those who live less than a mile from school, only 35% walked or biked, down from 89% in 1969. Now, these kinds of rules, this kind of culture, this safety-conscious culture that we've created, were just unheard of in previous generations, right? In fact, I remember driving by one of my children's school a while back, and parents were carrying the backpacks of their children, right? But we're here to try to help a generation become tough and help them become resilient. And by the way, brothers and sisters, I recognize that the world is really different than it was in the 1950s or 60s or 70s. And there's a lot of creepiness out there. I'm very aware of that. The question, I think, becomes is maybe have we gone too far, right? Dr. David Fassler, a child-adolescent psychiatrist, said that teenagers today just haven't had enough bad things happen to them. And in order for children to learn how to cope with normal frustrations and the ups and downs of life, we have to experience those frustrations. A child cannot develop resilience when their parents are constantly at their side, interfering with their development, their autonomy, their coping skills. And maybe some of you have had that experience. I have it all the time in my ward where I'm trying to talk to a youth and their parents are in the room, and the parents dive in and start answering every question, not allowing that child to develop the skills to talk to an adult, to be conversant, to be able to just have a normal conversation with someone. And so our prophets and apostles are in tune to this kind of culture, this safety-conscious culture, this coddling culture, this helicopter parenting that we're referring to today. And years ago, guys, think of this, 45 years ago now, is when Elder Neal A. Maxwell said that those who do too much for their children will soon find that they can do nothing with their children. And so many children have had so much done for them, he said, that they've almost been done in. Now you think about what was happening in the mid-1970s when Elder Maxwell said that. And think about where we are today and how much more relevant his statement is regarding just going over the top, snowplow parenthood, helicopter parenting, those kinds of things. So let me share with you what I would call principle one today. And I think I want to lay a little doctrinal foundation here, a little gospel framework to help us understand these concepts better. Many of us have experienced life's hard knocks, and we understand that those hardcore experiences in life, those challenges and those trials, have helped us to develop our character and strengthen our resolve and helped us to become better people, right? And so the question is why do so many parents who have experienced hard things in their lives cushion every blow, so to speak, or protect their children from every disappointment instead of allowing them to experience life? I love this statement from Elder Maxwell that, brothers and sisters, I have no hesitancy in saying that unless checked, permissiveness, and you can think of permissive parenting if you'd like, by the end of its journey will cause humanity to stare in mute disbelief at its awful consequences. Now that applies on many different levels, but I think what a great statement by Elder Maxwell. We understand that by allowing our children to get occasionally bruised in childhood, we are helping them make certain that they don't get broken in adolescence. And by allowing them allowing them to have those failures during their teenage years, we are also laying a great groundwork for success in adulthood. I didn't think of it at the time, but I'm so grateful that I had some failures in my life as a high school student because that prepared me so well for the mission field. And I'm so grateful for those failures as a missionary because that prepared me for other failures I would have and challenges in college and then in marriage and then in parenting and all those other things that come along the way. We know that resistance molds and shapes our character. Now, I want to share an experience with you that was told in a general conference a few years back by Elder Stan Ellis of the Quorum of the 70, who just happens to be from the same part of Texas that we're from. And remember President Ellis, our stake president, with fond admiration. But he said this: hard makes us stronger, humbles us, and gives us a chance to prove ourselves. Our beloved handcart pioneers came to know God in their extremities. Hard is part of the gospel plan, he said. And one of the purposes in this life is for us to be proven. And in the world of nature, hard is part of the circle of life. It is hard for a baby chick to hatch out of that tough eggshell, but when someone tries to make it easier, the chick does not develop the strength necessary to live. Before my present calling, Elder Ellis said, I was a financial consultant in Houston, Texas. Most of my work was with millionaires, multimillionaires, who owned their own businesses, and almost all of them had created their successful businesses from nothing through lots of hard work, he said. The saddest thing for me was to hear that some of them say that they wanted to make their children's lives so much easier. They did not want their children to suffer as they had or go through the toil or the challenges that they did. In other words, they would deprive their children of the very thing that made them successful, that made them who they are. Well, brothers and sisters, we know that this is part of the gospel plan, that resistance, that opposition, that character building is part of the plan. So why in the world are we taking that away from our children? Why are we cushioning those blows? I love what some of our prophets and apostles have taught regarding this. Here's Elder Packer. Teach our members that if they have a good, miserable day once in a while or several in a row, to stand steady in the face of them. Things will straighten out, and there's great purpose in the struggles of life. How about President McKay? There is no development of character without resistance. There is no growth in spirituality without overcoming. And then my favorite, President Benson. While I do not believe in stepping out of the path of duty to pick up a cross that I don't need, a man is a coward, he says, who refuses to pick up a cross that lies within his path. And then he says this, and guys, I have no idea why this is not on Twitter, why it's not on Pinterest, why it's not on t-shirts or bumper stickers or the theme of every youth conference across the country. No cross, no crown. No gall, no glory, no thorns, no throne. Now, some of you may be very familiar with a piece of poetry that I heard years ago, And it's become even more significant to me as I've become older and now have children and grandchildren of my own to raise. The tree that never had to fight for sun and sky and air and light, but stood out in the open plain and always got its share of rain, never became a forest king, but lived and died a scrubby thing. And the man who never had to toil to gain and farm his patch of soil, who never had to win his share of sun and sky and light and air, never became a manly man, but lived and died as he began. Good timber does not grow with ease. The stronger the wind, the stronger the trees. The further the sky, the greater the length. The more the storm, the greater the strength. By sun and cold, by rain and snow, in trees and men, good timbers grow. Where thickest lies the forest growth, we find the patriarchs of both. And they hold counsel with the stars, whose broken branches show the scars of many winds and much of strife. This is the common law of life. And brothers and sisters, not only is it the common law of life, it's the common law of the gospel. We know that resistance brings character. We know that perseverance helps us to become like our Heavenly Father and like our Savior. So now let's introduce the topic of grit and the subject of grit. Grit is probably one of my favorite words. In fact, my children all know, the ones that are married, that whoever names their child Grit, be it boy or girl, will have my vote, right, for a free college education. So let's talk about what grit really is. It is a mix of passion, perseverance, and self-discipline that helps us to keep moving despite obstacles. It's not flashy, and that's precisely the point. It is that hard hat, lunch pail mentality of going and showing up every day, not being afraid, having courage, sticking it out, trying new things, doing hard things, and all that goes with that. All right, so let me share with you a little bit about grit from Angela Duckworth's famous book on the topic of grit. Her book, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. I recommend it to all of you. She defines grit as working strenuously towards challenges, maintaining effort and interest over years despite failures, adversity, and plateaus in progress. And then the key, and that is this, that grit is a greater predictor of success than talent. In fact, brothers and sisters, one of my favorite things to say to my children as they enter the mission field is, look, there's going to be missionaries that are going to be in your mission that are probably related to famous people. There will be missionaries in your mission that will be smarter than you, some probably better looking. Some have had experiences in life that you don't have. Most will be wealthier than you, that's for sure. But none will be grittier than you. None will work harder than you. See, I think grit is a talent that we can develop. It's a skill that we can acquire, but it is more related to success than any other factor. And that's what Angela Duckworth found in her research and in the book that she published on grit. No matter how talented you think you are, if you don't put in the work, you won't amount to much, she said. So she gave a great case study of West Point, and I want to share it with you. That's kind of dear to me because I have a great favorite brother-in-law who's a West Point graduate who just retired from the Army, so it's going to be hard for me to think about this without thinking of him. But at the United States Military Academy, there are 14,000 applicants every year. 4,000 obtain the required nomination, and then 2,500 of those original 14,000 meet the rigorous academic and physical standards, and then 1,200 are admitted. So we start with 14,000, and we whittle it down to 1,200. Although most of the students who come to West Point were varsity athletes and team captains, 1 in 5 cadets will drop out before their graduation. In fact, most of the dropouts will do so after 2 months, after a 7-week training period called, you're going to love this, the Beast. Now, who spends 2 years trying to get into a place and then drops out the first 2 months, was Angela Duckworth's question. She wanted to find that out. West Point candidates are accepted based on what they call a whole candidate score, which is the weighted average of an ACT and SAT exam scores, high school rank, expert appraisal of leadership potential, and performance on objective measures of physical fitness. The whole candidate score is the single most important factor in getting into West Point. Into West Point admissions, but it did not predict who would make it through the beast. In fact, cadets with the highest whole candidate score were just as likely to drop out as those with the lowest. Scores on the grit scale bore no relationship to the whole candidate score. In other words, how talented a cadet was said nothing about their grit and vice versa. In July of 2004, the second day of the beast, 1,218 West Point cadets sat down to take the grit scale. On the last day of the beast, 71 of the cadets had dropped out. Grit turned out to be the astounding, reliable predictor of who made it through and who didn't. The next year, Angela Duckworth said, I returned to West Point to run the same study. This time, 62 cadets dropped out of the beast. And again, grit predicted who would stay. So what does it matter? What is it that takes that has the most salient effect upon those passing their way through the rigorous physical challenges called the beast? It's not SAT scores. It's not high school rank. It's not leadership experience. Not even athletic ability. It's grit. Now, changing gears from West Point just for a minute. In one sales company in a 6-month period, they learned that 55% of the sales team left. Grit predicted number 1, who stayed, and number 2, who left. In another study in the Chicago public school system, students who graduated on schedule were grittier, and grit was a more powerful predictor of graduation than how much students cared about school, how aware they are of their studies, aware they were of their studies, and even how safe they felt at school. At the university level, Angela Duckworth found that in her studies that grittier adults were more likely to go further in their formal schooling. Adults who earned an MBA, PhD, medical degree, or law degree were grittier than those who graduated with just 4 years of school. Guys, this reminds me of an interesting experience I had when I was in my doctoral program at Utah State University years ago. I always felt that I was the mule at the Kentucky Derby with this group of 6 or 8 or even 10 students that I was going through that program with. In fact, many of them, some were on scholarship, some had received all kinds of grants and funding for their educations because of their intellectual abilities. When we took our comprehensive exams, at the end of that experience, I was one of the only students who did not pass one of the questions. If you've ever done that before, there are 3 questions you're given, and you're given the day pretty much to sit down at a computer and take 2 hours to go from memory and answer each of those questions. On one of those questions, they did not pass me on it, and I had to do it over again. I think I was the only one. However, 6 months later, I was getting the final sign-off on my doctoral dissertation and graduating. No one else was. I was the only one. And I share that to not boast in any way other than saying that I learned a great lesson that day. I sat down with my major professor, Jay Swanevelt, Utah State University. We sat in his front yard on a bench and we just talked for a while. And I said to him, you know what, that's kind of funny to me that I'm the first one in our program that's done. That's crazy. I don't belong here. And he said, it's just a great reminder that the prizes often go to not those who are the smartest, but those who work the hardest. Now, we weren't using the word grit back in those days, but maybe he would have used that word, and I would have felt really good about that. Some of you know Will Smith, Grammy Award-winning musician, Oscar-nominated actor. Will Smith has thought a lot about talent, effort, and achievement. I've never really viewed myself as a particularly talented person, he once observed. And where I excel is in a ridiculous and sickening work ethic. And brothers and sisters, I would have to say the same thing going back to my story, not to keep playing that back, but in the one that I shared you, I would never want you to think that I'm trying to brag about something in any way, but what most of us lack in academic or intellectual ability, we can certainly make up for with a sickening work ethic, and that's what Will Smith is talking about here. The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is that I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill. I will not be outworked, period, he said. You might have more talent than me. You might be smarter than me. You might even be all of those things. You've got me in 9 categories, Will Smith said. But if we get on a treadmill together and there's 2 things, you're getting off first or I'm going to die. He said it's just that simple. The separation of talent and skill is one of the greatest misunderstood concepts for people who are trying to excel, who have dreams and who want to do things. Talent you have naturally. Skill is only developed by hours and hours and hours of beating on your craft. I would add that skill is not the same thing as achievement either. Without effort, your talent is nothing more than your unmet potential. Without effort, your skill is nothing more than what you could have done but didn't. With effort, talent becomes skill, and at the very same time, effort makes skill productive. That's so good. I love that from Will Smith. I have watched over the years many parents who have insisted that their children don't work while they're in high school, right? They don't have a part-time job. They don't even work in the summer. They actually tell them your only job is to make good grades. Wouldn't it be better to teach our children, or at least add to that, grit, to help them develop those grit skills? Now, there are some distractions to developing grit. Let me share with you just a couple, and maybe there's hundreds of more. But one of the ones that I see most of all is this enamoration or obsession with screen time, right? In fact, I've talked to several kids in my ward this summer. I've learned, what do you do all day? Well, we wake up and we play video games, and we do that until about 1 or 2 in the morning, right? And that's their full day. That's not going to help anyone develop grit, by the way. High school seniors spend an average of 2.25 hours a day texting on their cell phones. They spend 2 hours a day on the internet. They spend 1.5 hours a day on electronic gaming. They spend half an hour a day on video chat. It's a total 6 hours a day with new media, and that's just during their leisure time. And then they spend about 17 hours a day in school, sleeping, or on homework. Nearly all of their leisure time is now spent on media. Interesting statistics. Another, the video gaming. If we wanted to even get more specific, especially for some of our young men, estimates average that a young person will spend 10,000 hours now gaming by the time they reach the age of 21. To put that figure in context, it takes the average university student 4,800 hours to earn a bachelor's degree. 10,000 hours in gaming, 4,800 hours, half of that in a bachelor's degree. And 2/3 of children, over 66%, report that their parents have no rules regarding their media consumption. Another distraction to grit would be just the life of ease, a life with little expectations. I'm surprised today how few of our teenagers are working or have jobs or have chores or have rules. Their life often consists of what Elder Oaks once said of being amused to death. Summers are filled with playing excessively, vacations, and hanging out with friends. I have an 18-year-old daughter right now that's a little upset because she has to work all summer while her friends travel the world, right? But we're trying to help her develop some grit. Let's talk about teaching grit to our children. One of the things that we learn in research is that when children have parents who are both warm and supportive, but also demanding, we call that authoritative parenting, then the outcomes and the results for children that are raised in that kind of environment with parents who will challenge them, with parents who have expectations, chores, and rules, but also who are warm, who use affection and have relationships and connect with their kids. The outcomes are pretty awesome and wonderful for children who grew up in that setting. Teens with warm, respectful, and demanding parents earned higher grades in school, were more self-reliant, suffered from less anxiety and depression, and were less likely to engage in delinquent behavior, Duckworth reports in her book. How about this? Growing up with support, respect, and high standards confers a lot of benefits, one of which is really relevant, especially relevant to grit. In other words, wise parenting encourages children to emulate their parents. Because why? Because that connection is there. It is remarkable how many paragons of grit have told me with pride and awe that their parents are their most admired and influential role models. These exemplars of grit grew up not just imitating their parents, but also emulating them. If you want to bring forth grit to your child, first ask how much passion and perseverance you have in your own life. Parents, a great question for all of us. How are we demonstrating grit? What kind of grit do we have? And then ask yourself how likely it is as your approach to parenting encourages your child to emulate you, right? By the way, we find in research that permissive parents, the ones who give in to everything and almost view their children as equals with them, those children do not respect their parents as much as the parents think they may. All right. And so one of my favorite grit stories is told by or is centered around Grit Young. Grit Young, Steve Young's father, a great father in my mind. In fact, he's such a great father that when he came to visit our ward for another reason a year ago, he and his wife Sherry, I said, I have to get my picture with you guys because you are one of my heroes. And for many different reasons. But one of the things that I loved is in Steve Young's book here, and I could recommend it for sure, his book Behind the Spiral. But in his book, he just talks about the challenge that it was to go to Brigham Young University, to be like 8th on the depth chart, to realize that he may never, ever see action, then to be told by some coaches that maybe they'll move him to defense, watching others play, feeling like he would never, ever get his chance. And then other colleges that did want him, that did recruit him strongly, he knew now that if he would have gone to one of those schools, he probably would have been starting by his sophomore year. In fact, I'll pick the story up right here, but he tells his father, I should have gone to North Carolina. And then his father, Grit Young, says, Steve, you've barely been at BYU a month. You've got to hang in there. And Steve Young said, I'm done, Dad. I'm quitting. I'm coming home. And Steve Young said, my bags were packed. My dad cleared his throat. You can certainly quit, but you can't come home because I'm not gonna live with a quitter. So you can decide for yourself. Steve said, I hung up mad, but I stayed at BYU. And what a career Steve Young had. But these were parents that were going to teach their children how to be gritty. And that's one of the opportunities that we have, is to teach our children the same. From Madeline Levine, a great California psychologist, the author of the book, The Price of Privilege. She said, however, and this is a painful psychological truth, our primary responsibility as parents is not to gratify our children, which of course we do often and happily, but to make certain that they develop a repertoire of skills that will help them meet life's inevitable challenges and disappointments. We have to find a way to equip our children to do hard things, to be tough, to be gritty, right? And so I think one of the greatest things that we can do with that is we need to share our grit stories with our children. I bet you have them, and if you don't have them, you can look down your line of relatives, your ancestors. There's got to be some grit stories in your family. One of the ones that I want my children to know, and I always think of this, but I remember Mesa, Arizona years ago, moving into a brand new apartment. Life was pretty hard. We had just moved out of our home because of some financial challenges, moved now to a new ward. By the way, this story ends great. We end up being able to remove some renters and move back into our house and live happily ever after. But there was a brief period there where that was a challenge for us. But here we found ourselves in Mesa, Arizona, summertime, new ward. And to top that crazy week off where just life was not real fun, our one car that we had broke down. And our church was about a mile away, we found out. And at the time, we had 3 small children, the oldest being 3. And there was never a question. As my wife and I talked about it, we loaded our kids up in a stroller that held all 3 of them and walked down a canal in Mesa, Arizona, to our chapel where, once again, we didn't know a soul. Had we stayed home that day, no one would have known it. It was our first Sunday in church that day. In 110-degree heat. I tell that story about my wife. Not once did she ever think, oh my gosh, we shouldn't go to church today, or let's skip. That's where we need to be. But I want our children to know that story. I want them to know that. I want our grandchildren to know that about their mom. I want my kids to know about the time that in graduate school, I slept in a tent in someone's backyard to save money. I want them to know that story. I want them to know, my grandchildren, because my children do know, about the time in the mission field where I broke my pelvis and the doctor said, you need to go home. And I said, no way. There's no way I'm going home. I'm staying here. I want them to know that because I want them to know that that blood runs within them and that their ability to be gritty is in there. Just as it is for me, as I think of the ancestors who have gone before me and have done some amazingly hard things in their life, I know that that blood is in there. So what can we do? We teach our children to be tough. We teach them to be courageous. We don't coddle them when they are injured or when they're hurt. We certainly nurture them, but we don't want to ruin them in any way. We teach them to not whine or complain. I love the idea that this is a no complain zone in this home. We teach them to bounce back after trials and to be resilient. We encourage them to do so. We teach our children that they do not need to cry or become depressed just because things don't go their way. We teach them to be flexible. We teach them gospel principles, and especially the principle of perspective and trial. We create what I call a wimp-free culture in our homes. We encourage our children to do hard things and to try new things. Now, brothers and sisters, I'll never forget it. We moved into the ward that we live in now in 2011. It was in the summer. We went to church sometime in June, and the young women's president approached our daughters, one of our daughters, and said, did you know that Trek is this week and you're eligible to go because of your age? Would you like to go on Trek? We're actually going to Martin's Cove in Wyoming. And we thought as parents, that's pretty cool. We had just done a trek a couple years earlier in Texas, which consisted of walking around a cow pasture for 3 days. So the idea of actually going to Martin's Cove sounded pretty cool to us. And we encouraged our daughter and said, yeah, you should do that. And our daughter was not having it. Our daughter, Cassidy, was bound and determined she was not going to go. She said, look, I'm the newest kid in the ward. I don't know one person. There's no way I'm going to go on a trek when I don't know anybody. That would be so awkward. And so we encouraged her. We said, no, if you do this, you'll meet people. This will be great. And she kept saying no. And it was really funny because she would say things like, I'm not going to go. And we'd say, we know you're not going. But what equipment do we need to buy for the trek that's in 3 or 4 days? And we'd go take her shopping and buy that stuff. And the next day she would say, I'm not going. And we'd say, we know you're not going, but just try this Pioneer dress on. We just want to see how that works. And we kind of did that for a couple days. And even the morning, at 4:30 in the morning, as we drove our child down the hill from where we lived to our stake center, she was saying, you guys know that I'm not going. And we said, we know that you're not going, but just hang in there because we're almost at the church. We'll be there in 1 minute. Anyway, it just kind of went on like that. Now, we prayed that when we got to the church, ward members would surround her and would make her feel welcome. Not one member of our ward or stake said a word to any of us. We had just moved from a stake in Texas and in a ward where we knew everybody. And this was hard for even my wife and I. But we encouraged her to get on that bus and go. And she said, as she hopped on the bus, I'm not going, right? But she got on. She just always knew what was right. About a week later, we picked her up from the church, and she was so happy. And members of the ward had surrounded her. They got to know her. It was almost like they carried her off the bus like Cosmo the Cougar right above their shoulders. And parents and leaders came up to us and told us how grateful they were that she had come. And other youths came up to us and said that we knew all of that would happen if we just encouraged her and pushed her to have some grit and to move in that direction. And she did. And I'm so grateful for that. That changed her life. She ended up becoming the Laurels president in that ward a short time after that and had a great experience as she became a member of that ward. Now, I think about that, brothers and sisters, because years ago we sat in another meeting. Our ward was divided. And in the family behind us, who sat behind us, I heard a teenage girl say, Mom, this is stupid. I am not going to our new ward. And the mother said, that's okay, honey. You don't have to go. That's not teaching our children to be resilient. That's not teaching them to develop grit. And so I want to share with you kind of an experience that I had a few years ago that taught me a great lesson. We had the opportunity to travel from Dallas, Texas, where we lived at the time, to Las Vegas and to watch a BYU bowl game. We just happened to have a son who was playing in that game, and we wanted to be there for that. And on the way, we stopped in St. George. And in St. George at the Visitor Center, at that time in 2008, they were showing a movie called Only a Stonecutter. And many of you are super familiar with that movie, the great story of John R. Moyle, who not only loses a leg, but walks the 22 miles weekly to the Salt Lake Temple one way and then back to his home in Alpine for years as he served as the masonry superintendent at the Salt Lake Temple on a peg leg that he made. And he is the one, as you know, who chisels holiness to the Lord on the Salt Lake Temple and many other things, I'm sure, that he did. But as I sat there as the bishop of my ward in our Texas ward and watched that video, I just had an impression and a thought, and it was strong. And it was that the youth of our ward need to have a John R. Moyle type of experience. They need to do that. And I bought that video at the bookstore in St. George, Only a Stonecutter. I brought it home. I gathered all of our youth leaders together on a Wednesday night after Mutual. We watched that movie. And I said, I want our youth to have this experience. I want them to walk to the Dallas Temple. Now, we negotiated on the miles. I wanted to do the 22, but some of our sisters were much more sensitive to things, and they said, you know what, that may not be a bad idea. We've got some youth in our ward that probably aren't in that kind of shape. Could we cut it in half and do like 11 or 12 miles? And I said, okay, we'll do 11 or 12 miles on this one, but we're still going to do another one at 22. And before I left that ward and we moved here, we did that 22-miler. And not all did it, but some. But on that experience of walking to the Dallas Temple, I thought it was really cool. In fact, I want to share something with you here on that. I'm going to come back to Elder Maxwell, but I just want to share some pictures that we took on that trek. In fact, it's fun to see these kids because many of them now are married and have children on their own. They've served missions. They've had great experiences in their lives. But during that trek, walking those miles, one of our young men, Braden McFadden, there's Braden McFadden right there leading a band of deacons to the Dallas Temple. Braden was in my class at BYU just a few years ago. And he said, hey, do you remember the time we walked to the Dallas Temple? And I said, oh yeah, I remember that well. And he's told me about it a little bit in class, and he told me what a cool experience that was for him. And so I said, Braden, will you write that up? And he said, sure, I'll write it up. And so he wrote this, and I want to share it with you. The walk we did as a youth group to the Dallas Temple was one of the best and most memorable activities I ever did as a youth. And by the way, as a bishop, I always wanted our youth to do hard things. In fact, they had wristbands while I was their bishop in Texas that said, I can do hard things, right? And that wasn't just because there were some cute girls that were stuck with me for a couple hours of walking to the temple. We started off early in the morning and began our walk with periodic stops along the way to have many devotionals accompanied by time to sit and read our scriptures. I remember at first it just seemed like a game to me, with all of our deacons quorum using hit-and-run tactics along the line of youth to terrorize girls and leaders. But as we kept walking, the gravity of what we were doing and what it represented slowly set in. The last mile was one of quiet contemplation about the significance of what we were doing and how this was just a tidbit of what early members of the church had done to sacrifice in building Zion. We finally saw the angel Moroni marking the completion of the walk. Our bishop gathered us in the alleyway. Now, I did not want to gather them in an alley. I know that sounds very uneventful, but I wanted them to, if you've ever been to the Dallas Temple, I wanted them to see it for a long time as they walked right into the front of it. And because of the way it sits on a street in Dallas, you couldn't do it by just going on the main street. So we gathered in an alleyway, and we pointed ourselves directly to the temple. He said, I don't remember much about what the bishop said on that last stop. I was exhausted and daydreaming about the Chili's dinner my dad had promised me if I did this walk. But those last couple steps will always stay with me. As we began our final approach, all the youth and the leaders linked arms and walked together to finish the trek. There were no stranglers or individuals far in the front or in the back. We did it completely together. That trip became a strong metaphor to me about life in general. We all walk, maybe flippantly at first due to innocent youth, but as we grow older and the walk stretches out, the somber realities of life set in. But life is a beautiful thing when punctuated by spiritual experiences. He said that keep us grounded and motivated towards our final goal. And when that goal is in sight, like the temple was for us, There was no one that finishes first or last. We all finish together, and we are all better for it. That 10-mile trek was an amazing and truly is one of the greatest experiences I've ever had as a youth. Well, brothers and sisters, that's why I'm big on helping our youth engage in doing hard and difficult things, because it builds their character. It prepares them for other things that will happen in their lives. So what could we do? 5 ways to teach grit to our children. Number 1, we've already talked about it, but using examples from our own life and from the lives of our family members, our relatives. Number 2, let our children do things for themselves. Never do anything for them that they can do on their own. Teach your children and expect them to do hard things and put challenges in front of them. Help them find things that they're passionate about in their lives. Help your children do things that are outside of their own comfort zone. Oh boy, I think that's such great counsel for us. Well, brothers and sisters, I'd like to conclude with 2 thoughts. One, from Sherry Dew's great message on You Were Born to Lead, You Were Born for Glory. It's a talk that she gave at BYU on December the 9th, 2003, and I would encourage all of you to pull it up, because there's some great statements that she makes to our BYU students in those days. She likens them to being the last leg to be run of a relay, where the coach positions the strongest runner. You are recommended, she said, to help run the last leg of that relay that began with Adam and Eve because of your premortal spiritual valor, she said. You simply must understand this because you were born to lead by virtue of who you are. You were born to lead as mothers and fathers because nowhere is righteous leadership more critical than in the family, she said. You were born to lead as priesthood and auxiliary leaders, as heads of communities, companies, and even nations. You were born to lead as men and women willing to stand as witnesses of God at all times. Now, brothers and sisters, just on Sunday, just a few days ago, and this recording is at the end of July, I stood in front of my youth, the youth in our ward, and spoke to them as the last time, because I will be released in a few coming days in my present calling. And I told our youth, look guys, it is not enough anymore to just be mediocre members of the church. What the Lord needs of you is to be strong and valiant, to be powerful, and to be resilient, and to be leaders. We want them to be leaders, right? Not just to be average members of the church. We have plenty of those, but we need leaders today, especially of our youth. Well, Sherry Dew continues, if you've hoped to passively, comfortably live out your lives, let me burst that bubble for you. And don't misunderstand me. This is a magnificent time to live. But she goes on to say that the last days are not for the faint of heart or the spiritually weak or those who are out of shape. There will be days when you will feel defeated, exhausted, and plain old beat up by life's whiplash. People you love will disappoint you, she said, and you will be disappointed. You may disappoint them. You'll probably struggle, she said, with some kind of mortal appetite. And some days it will feel as though the veil between heaven and earth is made of reinforced concrete. At that, you even may face a crisis of faith. In fact, you can count on trials that will test your testimony and your faith. How prophetic that was by Sister Dew. And then she said, aren't you glad I came bearing such optimistic news? But actually, I am nothing if not optimistic about you, for everything about your lives is an indicator of our Father's remarkable respect for you. He recommended you for now, when the stakes are so high, and now is the day when his kingdom is being established once and for all, never ever again to be taken from the earth. This is the last leg of the relay, and this is why he needs his strongest runners. The simple fact is our Father in heaven did not recommend Eve or Moses or Nephi or countless other magnificent exemplars for this dispensation. He recommended you and he recommended me. Do you think God would have left the last days to chance by sending men and women that he could not count on? Brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers, we need to raise a generation of youth that our Heavenly Father can count on. And that is who you are. Now, brothers and sisters, I conclude with one final story told by Gerald Lund. He said, years ago, I was in a church history class at BYU, and we had studied the Missouri persecutions, the exile from Nauvoo, the sacrifices of the saints, as they made the arduous journey across the plains to the Rocky Mountains, especially the Willie and Martin handcart companies. After we rehearsed that catalog of adversity and suffering, one of the students said this, "Why in the world was it so hard?" I know they were being tested, but why did it have to be so relentless and so intense? The professor's answer showed tremendous insight into the purposes of God. He said, you have to realize this. There was a great work to be done, and these people were just common people. They weren't great crusaders or proven heroes. However, by the time they reached the valley, many of the physically weak had died, and almost all of the spiritually weak had apostatized. So all that Brigham Young had left to work with was pure steel, he said. Well, brothers and sisters, we need a generation now of pure steel. We have to have that in these last days. For those who aren't resilient, for those who don't have grit, it's going to be hard for them to make it, to stay afloat, so to speak, in the gospel. We have a daughter who served a mission in Costa Rica, and on her mission there, she had that sign made, our family name, and that pure steel right below it. Why? Because of this story, a story that's been told in our family for a long time now. Our daughters and our children are close, and when they have babies, when they go through hard things in their lives, when difficult challenges happen, that phrase, pure steel, always comes up. It's a great theme for our family. I know that our Heavenly Father loves us, and I know that He needs us. Not only does He need us, but He needs the children today, the younger generation, this great generation that lives right now, who are teenagers, who are growing up in a challenging, crazy world, who have already had so many challenges in their life already. They'll have more. We'll all have more. But one of the ways to face those challenges head on is to become made of pure steel. I believe that's what Heavenly Father wants for all of His children, so that we can bless and help those around us in the very last days on the earth. And I share that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.